From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. What happens to a ship when it's on its last sea legs? Over the years, Canada doesn't have a good answer for that question. A Toronto Star exclusive investigation finds how risky dead ships can and have caused big destruction when they're not dealt with properly. And it raises questions about oversight from the federal government on dealing with huge vessels past their expiry dates. The cost can be huge financially, like the time a dead ship broke off from a tugboat and ended up on a Nova Scotia shoreline, taking 4 years and $20 million to remove it. Dead ships can be dangerous too, often carrying tons of leftover fuel and hazardous waste on board. My colleague Moira Welsh, investigative reporter for the Toronto Star, reported on the loopholes and lack of transparency over what happens to ships at the end of their run. She joins us to talk about the rough seas, big money, and massive cleanups when things go sideways. Moira, thanks for joining us. Great to talk to you.
Thanks for inviting me today. Nice to talk to you as well.
When we're talking about these huge vessels known as dead ships, what exactly are we talking about here? You know, especially for people who may not know the shipping industry, how would you define what a dead ship is?
The specific ships that we're referring to in this story are freighter ships that would go through the Great Lakes. And in some cases, they would also be coastal ships that would be built to run along the coast of, for example, the eastern seaboard, not out into the ocean. They're not built to withstand those big, powerful waves, but they do their business. They carry cargo, salt, iron ore, grain along all the waterways and ports.
Right. Okay. So who gets to decide that then the ship is dead, that it's at the end of their life? Who gets to decide that? Is it when it's no longer safe? How do we know when it's quote unquote dead?
Usually the shipping company decides they own it. So they will be replenishing their fleet of ships, so to speak, over the years. And so most of the ships that I'm writing about in this story probably built in the late 70s, early 80s. Some are even older, but for the most part, they're roughly 40 to 45 years old. And they've just basically reached the end of their life. One of the ship owners warned Transport Canada that there were concerns from the shipping industry that SAL, which was actually at the time known as Solarium, was quite worn out, in part because its cargo for many years had been salt, and salt will corrode the ship. And so ultimately, Solarium was retired and then purchased by a new owner who renamed it SAL.
Okay, so these are work ships. They've been transporting goods across lakes for decades. What happens after it's decided that these ships are dead? Do they get stripped down for steel? What happens to them?
So what happens when a company decides that the ship is no longer going to be in service is they will look around for a buyer, and they will look for a buyer who will usually bid the most amount of money for the ship. And in many cases, that is an overseas buyer or broker. And that new buyer will agree with these companies. The big companies will determine that, it must be properly recycled at a European accredited shipyard in usually, not always, but usually in Aliaga, Turkey. And it must be safely towed. These are the policies that these big, large shipping companies say that they have, and that's they follow. And so what happens then is the owner will change the name of the ship. So for example, the Solarium was renamed SAL. And then they will put a different flag on the ship, often, not always, but often. And sometimes those flags are from countries that don't always follow the best practices in terms of ensuring that the overseas journeys are safe for the crew and for the ocean in terms of pollution, for potential crashes, as an example. And then the tugboat gets involved. And so the tugboats are these big, hardy boats, and they come along and they hook up, they tether themselves to the dead ship, and off they go. And when they leave, for example, the port of Montreal, They'll pull them up through the St. Lawrence River and past the Canadian shores. And then it takes from Port of Montreal to Aliaga, Turkey, it takes about 5 weeks to pull a ship that distance. And what was really interesting is that the people who are critics of this practice say, you cannot determine the weather for 5 weeks in advance. I checked that with Environment Canada, and they said usually weather reports are good for 5 to 10 days at the max, and then the accuracy disappears. So the concern is, how do you know that the weather is not going to create, really dire circumstances for these laker or coastal ships that are not built to withstand these big, long, powerful waves in the ocean? And there's a risk that they will break up. And we've seen this happen in the past, and there's concern that this will simply happen again. So the fact is that these ships are built with a lot of hazardous waste. So it's within the body of the ship, and there's still remaining oil or diesel fuel left over. There are PCBs, there are heavy metals, there's a lot of asbestos built into, especially the old ships. So if a ship does go down, there are no outward necessarily signs of pollution, but certainly as it is broken up in the bottom of the ocean, all of those hazardous wastes will be excreted into the body of the water.
So there's a few really troubling things going on here. A, they are being towed great distances, and these, again, are ships that are built for lakes. They're not built for oceans, so they're being towed a great distance. They're carrying a lot of hazardous waste, is what you're saying. And we've seen what actually happens, right? You cite the case of MV Minor that ended up in Nova Scotia. What happened there? That, in a certain sense, it's almost a worst case scenario of everything coming together.
So the tugboat Hellas took the MV Minor and was towing it out to the ocean. And partway past the coast of Nova Scotia, the line snapped. The line that held the Minor to the tugboat snapped. And the Minor became what they call a dead ship and became a ghost ship because it was floating on its own. It was simply drifting.
The MV Minor rests on the rocky coastline of Scattery Island. Heavy seas have punched 3 more large holes into the bulk carrier. Waves have twisted the ship's steel structure. Below the waterline is a whole other story. Bad weather has pushed the Minor further inland.
And the tugboat could not reconnect with the Minor. So the ship actually floated back toward a pristine island, a protected land in Nova Scotia called Scattery Island. And it crashed on the shore of this island. And it sat there for years, basically. The owner of the ship tried to do a few changes to help it along and disassemble it, but the owner ultimately disappeared. And so then the province of Nova Scotia was left holding the cost of all of this. And ultimately, they spent about $20 million to break down that ship and have it all towed away. And it sat there for about 4 years. And you can imagine the locals were very unhappy. These were special fishing grounds for them. And they simply did not like the fact that the system had allowed this ship to crash on their shores and would just be left there with no one to take responsibility.
We'll be right back. That's a terrible scenario from almost every angle, right? From a responsibility standpoint to an environmental standpoint. Again, these are protected grounds, to the actual cost to taxpayers. This is a Venn diagram of bad things when these ships are not being disposed of properly, clearly.
Yes, and what was so interesting is that the federal government, Transport Canada, had given the new owner what they call a green passport to say that most of the oils had been removed from the ship. So they said it was a clean ship leaving. But in fact, when the authorities came in, they discovered that there were several, like 20,000 or more liters of oil left on the ship, far more than had been suggested from this so-called green passport. So it really showed that the checks and balances that were supposed to be in place, in fact, were not. And the province, again, was left to clean this up.
So, who ultimately is at fault here for not just this MV Minor case, but when we're talking about how to responsibly break down these ships or to make sure that they are recycled in a proper way? Is it Transport Canada for giving the green light for ships to be towed? Is it the shipping companies that say that, they're selling it to the proper shipyards in Europe? Who's at fault here?
The experts in the industry and the people who are critical of this practice would essentially say it's both. They would say that the owners, which they have every right to sell the ships to whomever they choose, and they put in these provisions for safe recycling. But the critics say that they're ignoring the fact that there are so many risks to towing these more vulnerable ships overseas. Now, the owners of the company would dispute that and say that their ships can make it quite safely. And in fact, they often do, but it's called Russian roulette, as some people call it. And so Transport Canada has left this, and in a sense, they've allowed the industry to essentially regulate themselves in terms of ship recycling. And so they allow the shipping companies to decide who buys the ships and essentially where they're recycled. That's the key piece of this, where they are recycled.
That is a substantial part of your reporting. That is an argument from marine experts, from people in the Canadian shipping industry, that we could skirt all of this headache. That if shipping companies kept these ships here in Canada, that they recycle the ship parts here, why doesn't that happen more often then?
Well, it's a good question. The shipping companies say that the recycling overseas is safe. The recyclers here feel that they can't pay the amount of money that the overseas buyers can pay the shipping companies. So they feel that's a significant reason why the companies are sending their dead ships overseas. Now, in Canada, we actually do not have ship recycling policies. But one of the main ship recyclers in Canada, the biggest, has been raising these issues with Transport Canada for years. They operate a pretty good recycling yard in Port Colborne. And their method is they bring the ships fully out of water with a winch and pneumatic airbags that help roll it onto shore. And then they pull it down far from the shoreline. And they pay their staff. They have very specialized staff. So they say that they've got a lot of training. They're paid substantial wages to do this work because it's very dangerous. They even have their blood tested for heavy metals every 3 months. And so those are sort of, in a sense, self-imposed practices, but at the same time, they have to follow about more than a dozen anyway, regulations and policies from federal governments and from provincial governments related to worker safety and environmental issues. So while we don't have specific ship recycling rules here in Canada, they certainly are following a lot of very strict protocols.
And we don't know for sure that if these dead ships are being shipped elsewhere, if those same standards are being met elsewhere. We don't know that for sure, even though the shipping companies say they are, right?
Well, it's really interesting. I spoke with an NGO called Shipbreaking Platform, and they do a lot of work in this area around safe ship recycling. So Turkey has improved its standards. Some of its yards have improved its standards, and 8 out of 27 yards are now accredited by the European Union ship recycling rules. And so they started being accredited in late 2018. And the ships do not follow the same practice that the marine recycling company does in Port Colborne. They have what the NGO calls land recycling. So they will pull the ship partially onto the shore and recycle the part that's pulled up on land, but the rest of the ship will be in the ocean. Now, in other countries, such as India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, the ships are recycled in beach recycling. So that means that they're pulled apart while they're sitting in the ocean entirely, which is very dangerous. And there are also a lot of worker injuries and deaths there. In Turkey, they have improved. They're still following land recycling, which is not the top level. It's much, much better than beach recycling. But there were also, in the last roughly 6 to 9 months, 2 worker deaths in these European accredited shipyards. And the NGO says that they need to still do a much better job at training workers for safety and making them aware of the dangers of the pollutants that they're also inhaling, for example.
As we can see, dead ships have the potential to be so destructive when they're dealt with in the wrong way. You've explained how marine experts say that shipping companies have quite a lot of leeway in how they deal with this issue. So, 2-part question. Is it time for Transport Canada to take back some control? And is there any political will, political pressure to do something about this?
The activists in this area would suggest that there's very little political will to take this on. These are big, powerful companies, and they don't feel like the recyclers have the power of the voice that perhaps these companies may have. But Transport Canada could do a much better job of regulating where these ships go. And certainly when you look at ships that are not built to withstand the ocean waves, and it's not just the recyclers who are saying this, it is ship designers and marine surveyors who play a very important role in recommending whether a ship can go overseas or not. They say Lakers and coastal ships are simply not designed for this. So it's better simply to stay in Canada. And in that case, there would be the capacity to recycle them here. Certainly, the main ship recycler that does these big vessels has lost a lot of business over the past years. It's still getting some, but it's losing a lot of business. So they would have to build up again. But that could absolutely happen, according to what they've told me.
Moira, fascinating story about shipbreaking and what happens to dead ships. Thank you for reporting on this and helping explain that.
Thank you so much.
And that is Moira Welsh, investigative reporter for the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.